Hi, my name's Amy. Welcome to a foundation paper piecing tutorial. So if you are brand new to foundation paper piecing, this video is for you. So we are going to go over step by step what you need and how to do each step for foundation paper piecing. There is a previous video that went through all the supplies and what they were and what I recommended. So if you are still at that beginning stage where you need to gather the supplies, go back and find that previous video. But right now we're going to get started on foundation paper piecing. Let's go. All right, so you can see that we're going to start here with our workstation. So my sewing machine is just over here. We have a rotating cutting mat. This is my Sew Tights cutting mat that I love. A nice small rotating cutting mat that we can leave really close to our machine. This is an add a quarter plus ruler. So hopefully you can kind of see that on there. Add a quarter plus. What this does is it has two sides. I'm going to show you how to use this. The first thing you're going to need is your foundation paper. So this is a foundation paper for a square and a square and a square. You're going to see that there's numbers on this paper. We're going to start with spot number 1. You'll also note that on the edge I've left that dashed line, which is the edge of your seam allowance, okay? We want to make sure that stays on there. So to start, we're going to actually flip this over and we're going to put a little bit of glue in that center number 1 spot. You're going to take your piece of fabric. For this particular square, if you were doing this in the 6-inch block, just like we are, then you are going to cut that center square to either 3 3/4 or 4 inches. What I do is I'll hold up the block to the light, hopefully you can kind of see this, till I know that that block is pretty much centered into that space. We want to make sure that it covers this entire 1 block with the solid line, but also all the way out to this dashed line, because that will ensure that we are all the way out to the edge. Once that's there, we're going to give this a little press to try to adhere that glue. And then once you have that, we're going to flip this over. Now this is where that rotating cutting mat comes in handy because we can turn this around. We are going to find the number 2. So we glued down piece 1. We are going to find now the solid line between the number 1 and the number 2. And then I'm going to place my ruler. This is the skinny side of the ruler. I have labeled it here so it says fold, just as a mental reminder to myself, because in the beginning you feel a little awkward with your foundation paper piecing. So I line up that ruler against that solid edge, and then using the edge of that ruler, I'm just going to crease that paper, okay? Now we are going to pull that ruler out and flip it over. And you'll see I put a piece of label tape there that now says cut. I'm going to push that fabric or that ruler over the edge of that paper. So you can see now there's a lip, and this lip has caught on the edge of this paper that we just folded. So now this little lip is leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. At this point, you're going to take your rotary cutter and let me unlock mine. And then we are just going to trim off any excess fabric that is beyond that 1/4 inch. So now you're going to see that when I remove my ruler, we have a 1/4 inch of fabric left on here. Now at this first step, you need to be very careful because the paper and that piece of fabric are not held together by anything other than that tiny bit of glue. So I'm going to hold onto the fabric and flip this over. We are now going to grab what we are going to call the inner corner fabrics here, okay? So this is going to be one of the inner corner fabrics. This particular fabric I cut as a 3 1/2 inch square and then cut it on the diagonal. This gives you a little bit of excess so that you have some wiggle room as you're attaching this. We are now going to attach this with the right side down to that edge that we just cut. I lift this up so I can see the point on the other side of the paper. Hopefully you can kind of see that point right there. And we're going to line up so that this point is about even with that point. So when we flip this over, it will cover all of this triangle space and that 1/4 inch all the way around. Very carefully, we are going to flip this over, holding those fabrics in place, and we are going to stitch on the solid line right here between the 1 and the 2. So you're going to bring this over to your sewing machine and stitch starting here and ending here. You are not going to stitch into the seam allowance, only on the solid line. So as we bring this piece over here, you'll see I have a laser on my machine. I'm going to line up that laser so it hits that dot perfectly. And then I'm just going to stitch directly on that line on the paper. When I get to the end, I'm going to cut the thread. The lovely part at this point is now the paper is firmly attached to the fabric, okay? So the way you're gonna test this is you're gonna fold this back and you are going to hold it up to the light just to make sure that it covers all of this square and the 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around, okay? So if there's any question in your mind, you can always bring it over to your little pressing station, which I just put right over here. I try to make my life easy. And we are just gonna give this a quick press, okay? So nice hot iron, give it a quick press on the fabric side, not the paper side, okay? So now you'll see that we kind of have our piece. You can flip this over, and if I turn you, you're gonna be able to see that it's fully covering that spot, okay? Hopefully you can kind of see that shadow right there. So now we're gonna flip this over, bring this back to our cutting mat, and we are gonna do the same thing. So we flip this over, we are gonna find the next number in line, which is gonna be number 3. Line up the fold side of our ruler with that solid line and create a crease. Then we take the ruler and we flip it over, let that edge catch on that folded piece of paper, grab your rotary cutter, and give it a quick cut. Now this time, we don't have to be quite as gentle because this is now semi-attached, right? So we can do the same thing. We can line up this triangle, trying to get it so that it's in line with that point, which you can kind of see through the paper, which is the beauty part of it. And then we are gonna bring it over to our sewing machine. I'm gonna try to turn you so you can see this step. So you'll see, we just line up the edge of the fabric like so. I'm gonna move my ruler out of the way, and then I'm going to flip it over. Then we slowly push it in. I line up that laser point right with the edge on the solid line, and I stitch. And I'm just gonna give it a quick trim of that thread. And you'll see we now have this, okay? So I'm gonna now just turn over to the pressing station, and we are just gonna give that a quick press. So we just wanna try to get this as flat as we can so that we can get to the next step. So we come back to our cutting station, right? So you'll see this is just a lot of movement back and forth. We are now gonna go to number 4, which is over here. On the solid line, we line up the edge of the ruler and we fold. If this piece of fabric is sticking up, just pull the fabric down. Yes, it might rip the paper, that's okay. And then create that crease. Once you have that crease, you're gonna fold your add a quarter ruler over, line up that lip with the edge of the paper, and then use that rotary cutter to cut that. Now at this stage, we can actually go ahead and prepare step 5. So I'm gonna we just folded for step 4, but we're gonna fold for step 5 too. Why not, right? We can save ourselves that time on the next step. So we create the fold on the solid line, we flip over our add a quarter ruler, use that rotary cutter, and trim off the excess fabric. So now we have what looks like this. We're gonna grab our next 2 pieces of those inner corners. So once again, just to go over the cutting instructions for this particular block, these blocks you're gonna cut at 3 3/4 or 4 inches. Either will work, okay? If you wanted to fussy cut these, you could. So if there was a particular image that you wanted to center, you could cut them out, fussy cut. This particular fabric, I did not worry about it, but some fabrics I do. Then when we get to these inner triangles, these are cut at 3 1/2 inches square, and then you just slice them on the diagonal. And then we are gonna see that we have that lined up and ready to go, and we are gonna bring it over to our sewing machine. And you just line up the laser with that line and stitch. I'm gonna cut the thread. And we can actually do the second piece before we press it, which is lovely. So you can see here, there's that piece, and it looks like it moved a little bit when I was stitching. Now, I could go back and fix that, but as long as it covers all of that space, we should be good. So I don't even have to worry about. This is one of the beauties of doing these pieces, is that because we're stitching on pre-made lines, as long as we trim it correctly, it will be right. So I'll show you in just a second. So now we're gonna sew on that last line. And we're gonna give that thread a little trim. And I'm going to bring this over to my pressing station. You guys don't need to see it this time. You know how to press. It's nothing earth-shattering that you need to see. So we give it a good press, and then you're going to end up with what looks like this, okay? So you can start to see, here's the finished block of what's going to look like our finished block, right? So now we are going to flip this over, and we are going to go to the next number, which is going to be number 6. We are going to create our fold on the solid line, connecting to the 6, flip that ruler over, line it up with the edge of the fold, and then trim off the extra fabric. Then you're going to do the same thing on the other side for number 7. Fold it back, flip, line up the edge, trim off the extra fabric. Okay, so now we're going to start working on attaching these pieces. These outer triangles, just so that you're aware, were cut to 4.5 inches square. You can see that they were 4.5 inches square, and then we cut them on the diagonal. And that's the perfect size for this particular block. I'm going to center it on here so that we know it's going to cover everything. You want to be sure that you're not pulling this fabric too much because it is cut on the bias here. So I could, you can see, really misshape this and bend this. So we want to make sure we're holding it very gently. And then we're going to bring it over to our machine, flip it over, and stitch on that line. Trim that thread. Then we're going to do the other side, so we can do the other side right away without pressing. And this is one of those beauty things where the more you do this, the faster you will get, because you start to realize that there are some tricks to cutting out some steps, because you can do each of these sides in between needing to press. So once we have this done, you can see these are nice and flat. I'm going to just give them a quick press. And then we have what looks like this. We are going to set this down, and we are going to do number 8, which is over here. Line it up on the solid line. Now you see how this fabric pulled up? I'm just going to pull the fabric down and let the paper rip, okay? And then make that crease. Flip over that ruler, line it up with the edge, and then cut off the excess. And then turn it. We're going to do for number 9 as well. You can see that fabric pulled up a little bit, so we're just going to pull it, and you're going to hear it's going to rip the paper, and that's totally fine. Flip this over, line it up, pull all that excess fabric away, and then you're going to take the next 2 pieces and line these up and give them a stitch as well. So as you can see, this doesn't take a long time. And now we're just going to take this over and give it that final press. Now I've allowed for these cutting instructions to give you enough that there is some to cut off, which I think, especially as a beginner, you want. Could you cut it closer? You absolutely could, but we don't need to cut it closer. So now I want you to see, right, this block and this block are now identical, right? They really truly are as identical as they can be. The points are really pointy. They all line up, right? The lineup of how they line up against this fabric is all exactly the same. This is the benefit of doing this type of piecing. Now what you're going to do is flip this over, and we are going to do our best to trim all the way around the edge. So we are going to take our ruler, just any ruler, it doesn't necessarily have to be this one, and you're going to line it up with the outside edge of this dashed line, okay? Because that's where that seam, it leaves room for your seam allowance to connect it to the next piece. And this is where having this rotating mat really comes in handy, because you can just rotate it, line it up, trim it. Sometimes at those corners where those seams meet, it does take a little bit of extra to get through that, which is why I do recommend a sharp blade. And then we're going to do the last side. All right, so here is the finished block, okay? So it is now the perfect size and everything's ready to go. What I would do is you can starch it at this point. I'm gonna wait till I rip the papers off. So this is what I think is the fun part. To me, this is similar to popping bubble wrap. Some people do not like this step, but I think it's all in the eye of the beholder. So now we are gonna rip these papers off. I start by holding down where the stitching is, and you're gonna see that I am gonna just start pulling towards that stitch, okay? And it's gonna come off where those perforations were from the needles, from the needle marks going in and out. So I'm just gonna pull all 4 of the edges off. So everywhere we stitched, it's created essentially a perforation mark. Okay, now you should just be able to kind of pop this open and then do these inside pieces. This is why we reduce that stitch length, because I find this is the magic number at which we are able to easily pull these away without any difficulty. You'll see there's a little piece that ripped there, so I'm just gonna get it up. And then this last piece sometimes can be a little tricky if you went crazy with the glue, but what I find is when I use the glue stick, it comes out very easily. So now you can see sometimes you'll have a little bit stuck in the corners. You can use a tweezer to get that out. You just don't want to pull out your stitches. But there is a finished foundation paper piece block. I hope that helps explain the basics of foundation paper piecing and that you can now work your way through a basic economy block that you may be able to find online. Now, can it get more complicated if there's more numbers and more pieces and the pieces get tiny and getting them to lay flat is problematic? Yes, it can get trickier. But the whole point is it's the exact same steps. It doesn't matter if there's 30 pieces in that block or if there's 8 pieces in that block. So try one of these, find the link in my bio. You can find this particular pattern. Remember, 3 3/4 to 4 inch size squares for the center. 3 1/2 inch squares that are cut on the diagonal for the inner triangles, and 4 1/2 inch squares cut on the diagonal for the outer triangles. And that's going to give you a 6 inch finished block, square and a square and a square FPP block. So it'll finish at 6 1/2, but once you've attached them all, they'll be 6 inch blocks. I hope this answers your questions and gets you started on a wonderful foundation paper piecing journey. If you have any questions, feel free to comment below or contact me through the link in my bio, and I'll do my best to answer your questions. Good luck and happy paper piecing.